Chapter 14, the Digestive System and Nutrition, Screencast 2. Now, this screencast is going to focus on what often might be called the lower GI. And so the first part we want to look at is the stomach. We want to think of the stomach as a storage container. It's also one of the areas that actually digests protein, and it's known for its acidic environment. So these are the general functions associated with the stomach. The other thing to keep in mind, the stomach is the organ that precedes the small intestine. So one of the things that the stomach is responsible for is regulating the rate at which partially digested substances move into the small intestine. Now, there's a number of different types in the cells, and so you don't need to be responsible for the cells, but you do need to be responsible for the substances. Now, hydrochloric acid is one, and what this does, this results in a stomach pH of about 2. And that's going to be one of the things responsible for breaking down large bits of food into smaller pieces. Now, intrinsic factor, this is also made by the same cells that secrete hydrochloric acid, so I do want you to know that. So hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor are secreted by the same cells, and intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12. Mucus is another significant secretion, and mucus is really important because what it does, it actually protects the lining of the stomach from the acidic contents. And that's actually why we don't see typically damage because of the thick layer of mucus that protects the wall of the stomach from the acidic environment. Now, another substance that is also secreted by the stomach is pepsinogen. Now, in that form, it's inactive, but because of the acidic environment, this is actually converted into the active form, pepsin, and this actually is responsible for the beginning of protein breakdown and digestion. Here we can actually see the mucosa. And notice what we have here. These are called gastric pits. And if we take a deeper look, okay, we can actually see the gastric pits. We can see a whole bunch of different types of cells, the mucus secreting cells, the acid secreting cells, the pepsinogen secreting cells, and we can see all that. But the gastric pits are really important, and then we can see that wall of mucus. Okay, so really good diagram that really kind of talks about what we see. Now, one thing that is very different about the stomach is it's the only part of the GI tract that actually has 3 layers of smooth muscle. So the innermost layer is an oblique layer, then I have the circular layer, then the longitudinal layer. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because one of the things that we're going to see here is the stomach kind of acts like a cement truck. It's mixing things up because there's a slurry of fluids, and as it's mixing those, as it's moving and contracting, those contents are mixed, and that aids in the digestion that takes place within the stomach. Now, this would be what we see as a peptic ulcer. And this is something that happens when the mucus barrier is actually damaged. So once again, that protective barrier of mucus is really important, and it prevents the start of these peptic ulcers. Now, as noted before, the action of the stomach makes it and it pushes it forward. So once again, we can think of the stomach contractions as blending the food, but also it's moving it forward to the inferior end of the stomach. So food moves basically from the lower esophageal sphincter to the pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter is right before the small intestine. Now, chyme, this is what the watery mixture of partially digested food and gastric juice is called, and this is what's actually going to move into the small intestine. Generally, it takes about 2 to 6 hours for the stomach to completely empty after a meal. Now, what's important to remember here, the stomach does not absorb nutrients. Now, 2 things that are absorbed through the stomach are aspirin and alcohol. Pretty much everything else is going to be absorbed in the small intestine, and what we're going to notice there, that is the primary organ of digestion and absorption. Here we can basically see the movement. So there's my lower esophageal sphincter, and as the stomach moves and contracts, we can actually see it's pushing down. Okay, so it's basically pushing down the contents. We can see that continuing to happen, and we actually can see things moving through. Now, when the valve closes, there's going to be this backflow overall, but very characteristic of how the stomach actually moves. Now, the small intestine, that is the primary organ of digestion and absorption. Now, keep in mind, the small intestine is actually right after the stomach, so it has to have the ability to neutralize the acidic contents of the stomach. So that's really important. Now, one other thing that's going to happen within the small intestine, lots of different secretions are going to be produced and added to that watery mix. So we're going to see digestive enzymes and bile. And what these enzymes are responsible for are breaking down carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids to small enough structures that they can actually be absorbed. Now, absorption, remember, moves across the wall of the GI tract and now moves into the body. And 90% of all absorption actually takes place in the small intestine. Now, keep in mind the small intestine is designed for absorption, so surface area is really important. So there's lots of surface area to allow absorption to take place. Now, the small intestine is divided into 3 areas: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. And what we'll notice here is, depending upon where we are in the small intestine, the mucosa adapts to increase the surface area to facilitate absorption. So we're going to see large folds, which are known as villi. So these are these microscopic projections containing blood and lacteal capillaries, and also microvilli. That may be sometimes referred to as the brush border. So these are cytoplasmic projections of the epithelial cells of the villi. So here we can see the villi, okay, and then we can kind of see the microvilli along. This is a expansion of a single villus, and so once again we can see the brush border all along, and we can actually see how well vascularized it is, and that green vessel is actually a lymphatic vessel. Okay, so that actually is responsible for lipid absorption.